The margins of this document contain notes in a different handwriting, apparently added years later by someone who had access to additional information. Systematic poisoning confirmed. Water supply contaminated with plant-based toxins. Estimated survival time, 6 days maximum. Before we continue with the story of Nancy Green and the horrors that unfolded at Harwick Plantation, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state you're watching from. Now let us uncover the truth behind one of Virginia's most carefully buried secrets. But to understand Nancy Green's terrible revenge, we must first journey back to the plantation where it all began. To a world where human beings were treated as laboratory specimens in the name of scientific progress. The Rappahannock River Valley in 1852 was a region where tobacco still ruled as king. But the conversations in Richmond's gentlemen's clubs had begun to shift toward more scientific pursuits. The Confederate States were not yet born, but Southern intellectuals were already obsessing over theories of racial superiority and the supposed scientific basis for their peculiar institution. These men, educated in the finest universities of the South, believed they could use the tools of modern science to prove what they had always assumed about racial hierarchies. It was in this atmosphere of pseudo-scientific racism that Dr. Edmund Harwick inherited his father's plantation and transformed it into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Harwick Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Virginia's most fertile soil, worked by nearly 200 enslaved souls. The property had been in the Harwick family for 3 generations, built on the wealth generated by tobacco cultivation and the brutal efficiency of slave labor. To any visitor approaching along the tree-lined drive, it appeared to be a model of Southern prosperity. The white-columned mansion gleaming in the morning sun, its broad verandas offering views of carefully manicured gardens, the quarters arranged in neat rows beyond the main house, the fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon, where morning mist rose from the Rappahannock. But beneath this veneer of genteel plantation life, Dr. Harwick was conducting experiments that would have horrified even the most hardened slave owner. The converted tobacco barns behind the main house had been transformed into what he called research facilities, equipped with the latest scientific instruments and stocked with chemical compounds ordered from suppliers in Richmond and Baltimore. These buildings, innocuous from the outside, contained the infrastructure for systematic human experimentation on a scale that would not be seen again until the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Nancy Green arrived at Harwick Plantation in the spring of 1850, purchased along with her 3 sisters, Rebecca, Sarah, and Martha, from a failing tobacco farm in Alamance County, North Carolina. The seller, a desperate planter named William Patterson who was facing bankruptcy, had been eager to dispose of what he described as problematic stock. Enslaved women who could read and write, despite laws forbidding such education. Nancy was 22 years old, tall and dignified despite years of brutal labor, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. What Nancy did not know was that she and her sisters had not been purchased for their agricultural skills, but for an entirely different purpose that would soon reveal itself in the most horrifying way possible. Dr. Harwick, a graduate of the Medical College of Virginia and corresponding member of the American School of Anthropology, had become obsessed with the writings of Samuel Morton, whose controversial measurements of human skulls claimed to prove the intellectual inferiority of the Negro race. Morton's work provided what appeared to be scientific justification for slavery, but Harwick wanted to go further. He believed that through selective breeding and controlled environmental factors, he could create empirical evidence of racial hierarchies that would justify the Confederate cause for generations to come and silence Northern abolitionists once and for all. The Harwick family consisted of Dr. Edmund Harwick, 43 years old and consumed by his scientific ambitions, his wife Cordelia, a Charleston belle who had enthusiastically embraced her husband's theories about racial science, his teenage sons Thomas and William, 17 and 15 respectively, who had been trained from childhood to view enslaved people as subjects for study rather than human beings. His younger daughter Margaret, just 13 but already showing disturbing signs of her family's casual cruelty. His elderly father, Colonel Jeremiah Harwick, a veteran of the War of 1812 who provided the financial backing for his son's research, and his brother, Captain James Harwick, who served as the plantation's overseer and enforced the brutal discipline necessary to maintain the breeding program. To the outside world, they were respected members of Virginia society, regular attendees at Episcopal services, generous contributors to local charities, and gracious hosts to the political and social elite of the region. To Nancy Green and her fellow slaves, they would become architects of unimaginable horror, perpetrators of crimes that violated every principle of human decency in pursuit of scientific theories that were as baseless as they were cruel. Nancy was initially assigned to work in the main house, where she quickly earned the grudging respect of Cordelia Harwick through her exceptional skills in reading, writing, and herbal medicine. Knowledge passed down through generations of her family, who had served as healers and midwives on North Carolina plantations. What Nancy didn't realize was that Dr. Harwick was carefully observing her abilities, making detailed notes about her intelligence and physical characteristics in a leather-bound journal that would later serve as evidence of his crimes. She had unknowingly become subject number one in his grand experiment, a human being reduced to a collection of measurements and observations in the service of a perverted scientific agenda. It was on a humid August morning in 1851 that Nancy first discovered the true nature of her situation. The oppressive heat of the Virginia summer had settled over the plantation like a suffocating blanket, and the morning air was thick with the scent of tobacco leaves and the ever-present smell of human misery that hung over the slave quarters. Nancy had been sent to deliver lunch to the doctor in his study, a converted tobacco barn located behind the main plantation house, where he spent increasing amounts of time working on what he called his research projects. As she approached the building, balancing a silver tray laden with cold chicken, biscuits and sweet tea, she could hear voices engaged in heated discussion. Dr. Harwick was meeting with a distinguished gentleman from Richmond, and Nancy recognized the visitor's voice from previous encounters. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, the infamous physician who had achieved notoriety throughout the South for his scientific theories about the mental deficiencies of the Negro race. Cartwright was the man who had diagnosed drapetomania, the supposed mental illness that caused slaves to flee their masters, and dysesthesia ethiopica, which he claimed was responsible for the laziness and disobedience observed in enslaved populations. Nancy paused outside the building, ostensibly to adjust the items on her tray, but actually to listen to the conversation taking place within. Through a crack in the wooden walls, she could see the two men hunched over a large table covered with charts, diagrams, and what appeared to be detailed measurements. The walls of the converted barn were lined with shelves containing glass bottles filled with various substances, scientific instruments that Nancy didn't recognize, and row upon row of leather-bound journals documenting years of observations and experiments. Through this crack in the wall, Nancy witnessed a conversation that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The two men were examining detailed charts and measurements, discussing breeding schedules and selection criteria as if they were planning the mating of livestock rather than determining the fates of human beings. Dr. Cartwright was explaining his theory that certain combinations of African tribal backgrounds would produce offspring with specific physical and mental characteristics that could be studied and documented to provide definitive proof of racial hierarchies. The female specimens you've selected show exceptional cranial capacity for their race, Dr. Cartwright was saying, pointing to a chart with Nancy's name at the top, surrounded by detailed measurements and observations. The Nancy subject in particular shows troubling signs of intelligence that we must work to diminish in her offspring. We cannot allow such anomalies to propagate, as they contradict our fundamental theories about racial capacity and could be used by abolitionists to challenge our scientific conclusions. Dr. Harwick nodded eagerly, his excitement evident in the way he leaned forward over the charts. I've already identified suitable male specimens based on your criteria. The breeding program will commence within the month, and I've prepared facilities that will allow for complete control over environmental factors during gestation and early development. Any offspring showing undesirable characteristics will, of course, be disposed of according to our established protocols. Nancy's blood ran cold as she realized they were discussing her and her sisters as if they were breeding stock. But the horror deepened as Dr. Cartwright opened a leather satchel and withdrew several glass vials containing what appeared to be various chemical compounds. The liquids ranged from clear to amber to deep red, and each vial was carefully labeled with scientific notations that Nancy couldn't decipher, but which filled her with instinctive dread. These solutions have proven most effective in our Richmond facility, Dr. Cartwright explained, holding up a vial of clear liquid that caught the light streaming through the barn's single window. A few drops in the drinking water of pregnant females will often result in convenient natural terminations if the fetal development shows undesirable traits. The muriatic acid solution is particularly useful for marking subjects who display excessive intelligence or rebellious tendencies. A few drops applied to the eyes will cause permanent blindness while leaving the subject alive to serve as an example to others. As Nancy watched in growing terror, Dr. Harwick took careful notes on the proper dosages and applications of these chemical solutions. The muriatic acid, she learned with mounting horror, was used to burn identifying marks into the skin of slaves deemed problematic, but could also be used in higher concentrations to destroy eyesight permanently. But more horrifying still was the casual discussion of infanticide, the systematic murder of babies who did not meet their experimental criteria, disguised as natural mortality and justified by perverted scientific theories. The meeting concluded with Dr. Cartwright handing over a thick envelope of what appeared to be official government documents, sealed with wax and bearing official stamps that Nancy couldn't read from her position. The Confederate Scientific Commission is most pleased with your preliminary results, he said, his voice carrying the authority of official sanction. Continue the breeding program as outlined in these documents, and remember, absolute secrecy is essential. What we're doing here will provide the scientific foundation for our cause when the inevitable conflict with the North begins. The evidence we gather will prove beyond doubt that the Negro race is incapable of self-governance and that slavery is not just economically necessary, but morally justified. Nancy fled back to the quarters, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had overheard. That night, huddled together in the cramped cabin they shared, she shared her discovery with her sisters, and together they began to understand the full scope of their predicament. They were not just slaves condemned to a life of agricultural labor. They were experimental subjects in a breeding program designed to produce scientific evidence of racial inferiority that would be used to justify the enslavement of their people for generations to come. Over the following weeks, Nancy observed the plantation with new eyes and began to notice details that had previously escaped her attention. Certain female slaves were being given special diets rich in nutrients that other enslaved people were denied, and they were housed in separate quarters that had been modified with better ventilation and cleaner conditions. Male slaves were being subjected to physical examinations and measurements that went far beyond anything related to their work assignments. Most disturbing of all, she noticed that several women who had given birth in recent months no longer had their children with them, and their inquiries about their babies were met with vague explanations about weakness, natural selection, and God's will that rang hollow in the face of what Nancy now knew about the true nature of Dr. Harwick's research. The systematic horror of Dr. Harwick's breeding program began in earnest during the fall of 1851, as the Virginia countryside exploded in brilliant reds and golds that contrasted starkly with the darkness that was descending upon the enslaved community at Harwick Plantation. Nancy and her sisters were moved to a special section of the slave quarters that Dr. Harwick euphemistically called the research facility, though everyone understood it was simply a more controlled form of imprisonment designed to facilitate his experiments. This converted tobacco warehouse had been divided into individual cells, each approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, equipped with a simple cot, a wash basin, and a small window that had been barred with iron rods to prevent escape. The walls were thick enough to muffle sounds, and the doors were secured with heavy locks that could only be opened from the outside. Each cell was numbered, and detailed charts hung outside each door, tracking the occupant's physical characteristics, breeding schedule, and experimental status. Nancy was the first to be subjected to the breeding protocol, paired with a man named Samuel, who had been purchased specifically for Dr. Harwick's program. Samuel was a field hand from a plantation in Henrico County, selected for what Dr. Harwick's notes described as superior physical specimens with diminished cranial capacity. In other words, a man whose physical strength was valued, while his intelligence was viewed as a liability that needed to be bred out of future generations. Samuel was a gentle soul, despite his imposing physical presence, a man who had been just as horrified as Nancy to learn the true purpose of their forced union, when Dr. Harwick explained the breeding protocol with the same clinical detachment he might use to describe any other scientific procedure. Both Samuel and Nancy understood that resistance would result in brutal punishment or death, but they also understood that their compliance would not guarantee the survival of any children they might produce. The conditions of their confinement were carefully controlled according to protocols that Dr. Harwick had developed through correspondence with other researchers throughout the South. Their diet was monitored and supplemented with various compounds that Dr. Harwick claimed would influence the development of their offspring, though Nancy suspected these supplements were actually experimental substances whose effects were being studied. They were forced to submit to weekly medical examinations where Dr. Harwick would measure various aspects of their physical development, take blood samples, and make detailed notes about their physical and mental state that were recorded in the ever-present leather journals. But the true horror began when Nancy's sister Rebecca became pregnant with her assigned partner, a quiet man named Joshua, who had been selected for similar reasons as Samuel. Dr. Harwick's excitement was palpable as he monitored Rebecca's pregnancy with unprecedented attention, visiting her cell daily to measure her expanding belly, test her reflexes, and subject her to various procedures that he claimed were necessary for the health of the developing child, but which seemed designed more to gather data than to provide medical care. When Rebecca gave birth to a healthy boy in the spring of 1852, Nancy initially felt a surge of relief that perhaps the nightmare was finally over, and that the baby would be allowed to live and grow normally among the enslaved community. The birth had been difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, but Rebecca had endured it with the stoic strength that characterized the women of their family, and the child appeared perfectly healthy and normal in every way. Her relief was tragically short-lived. Within hours of the birth, before Rebecca had even recovered from the ordeal of labor, Dr. Harwick and his son Thomas arrived with an array of measuring instruments and began subjecting the newborn to a series of tests that were as thorough as they were terrifying. Nancy watched in horror from her adjacent cell as the baby's head was measured from every conceivable angle using calipers and other devices. His reflexes were tested with sharp instruments, and his physical characteristics were carefully documented in yet another leather journal devoted specifically to the evaluation of experimental offspring. The examination continued for 3 days, during which the infant was subjected to procedures that would have been considered barbaric even by the medical standards of the time. Dr. Harwick used calipers to measure the infant's skull in minute detail, recorded the exact dimensions of facial features, tested responses to various stimuli, and made extensive notes about what he termed cognitive indicators and behavioral anomalies that only he seemed able to observe. After 3 days of intensive observation and measurement, Dr. Harwick made his verdict with the same detached scientific tone he might use to describe any other laboratory result. The child showed what he termed excessive cranial development and troubling signs of early cognitive function that contradicted his theories about the intellectual limitations of the Negro race. In his twisted logic, these were undesirable traits that made the child unsuitable for his research purposes and dangerous to the broader goals of the breeding program. The baby, he declared with chilling clinical precision, was a scientific anomaly that needed to be eliminated to preserve the integrity of the experimental data. The child's intelligence, rather than being celebrated as a sign of human potential, was viewed as a threat to the racist theories that the breeding program was designed to support. That night, Nancy heard Rebecca's screams echoing through the research facility, desperate cries that seemed to go on forever before finally dissolving into the heartbroken sobbing of a mother who had lost her child. When morning came, Rebecca sat in her cell like a broken doll, staring at nothing with empty eyes, her arms cradling air where her baby should have been. When Nancy asked what had happened to the infant, Dr. Harwick coldly explained that the child had suffered from natural weakness and had not survived the night, though his demeanor suggested that nature had received considerable assistance in this outcome. But Nancy had seen the small bottle of clear liquid that Dr. Harwick had carried into Rebecca's cell the night before, and she recognized it as the same substance that Dr. Cartwright had demonstrated during their meeting months earlier. Rebecca's baby had not died of natural causes. He had been murdered because he was too intelligent for Dr. Harwick's perverted scientific theories, killed because his very existence contradicted the racist assumptions that formed the foundation of the breeding program. Nancy's opportunity for reconnaissance came through her continued assignment to clean Dr. Harwick's study, a task that had originally been given to her because of her literacy and attention to detail, but which now provided her with unprecedented access to the documents and materials that would prove crucial to her developing plan for revenge. The converted tobacco barn had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory that would have impressed visitors from the finest medical schools in Richmond or Baltimore, complete with shelves lined with glass bottles containing various chemical compounds, detailed charts tracking the progress of his breeding subjects, and extensive correspondence with collaborators in what Nancy was beginning to understand was a vast network of similar facilities throughout the South. During her cleaning duties, which she performed with meticulous care while secretly memorizing every detail of the laboratory's contents, Nancy carefully catalogued the locations and contents of every chemical container. She learned to recognize the bottles containing muriatic acid, identifiable by their distinctive amber color and the way they seemed to emit fumes even when tightly sealed. The clear liquid that Dr. Cartwright had provided was stored in smaller vessels near the doctor's desk, each one labeled with scientific notation that Nancy gradually learned to decipher through careful observation and logical deduction. More importantly, she discovered Dr. Harwick's comprehensive journal collection, leather-bound volumes that contained not only records of his experiments, but also detailed instructions for the preparation and application of various chemical solutions, correspondence with collaborators throughout the region, and most damning of all, precise documentation of every infant murder that had been committed in the name of scientific research. The journals revealed the full scope of the horror that extended far beyond Harwick Plantation. Dr. Harwick was not working alone. He was part of a carefully organized network of plantation owners and physicians who were conducting similar breeding experiments throughout Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. The goal was to produce scientific evidence that would support the Confederacy's claims of racial superiority when the inevitable conflict with the North began, providing intellectual justification for slavery that could counter abolitionist arguments about human equality. Nancy read entries that described the systematic murder of dozens of infants who had shown undesirable characteristics such as above-average intelligence, physical coordination, or emotional responsiveness. She learned that the clear liquid was a concentrated solution of various plant-based toxins, including extracts from pokeweed, oleander, and castor beans that could cause death within hours, while leaving no obvious signs of poisoning that would alert authorities or raise suspicions among the enslaved community. The muriatic acid was indeed used for marking slaves, But Nancy discovered that Dr. Harwick had been experimenting with different concentrations and applications, developing techniques that could cause everything from superficial burns to permanent disfigurement to complete blindness, depending on the specific formulation and method of application. His notes contained detailed observations about the effects of different chemical combinations, recorded with the same clinical precision that a legitimate researcher might use to document the results of medical treatments. Most revealing was a recent letter from Dr. Cartwright that praised Dr. Harwick's innovative approaches to subject management, and specifically mentioned his success in eliminating cognitive anomalies in the experimental population. The letter also contained instructions for a new chemical compound that could be used to cause permanent blindness in subjects who displayed what they termed excessive visual intelligence, the ability to read and interpret their surroundings in ways that threatened the security of the operation. This compound, a carefully calibrated mixture of concentrated lye and muriatic acid, was designed to destroy the corneas and optic nerves while leaving the victim alive to serve as both punishment and example to others who might consider resistance. Dr. Cartwright's letter included detailed instructions for its preparation and application, noting that it should be administered as eye drops, while the subject was physically restrained to ensure complete contact with the optical structures. As Nancy read these instructions with growing horror and rage, a terrible plan began to form in her mind. The same chemicals that Dr. Harwick intended to use to destroy the sight of rebellious slaves could be turned against their creators with devastating effectiveness. But Nancy's plan went beyond simple revenge. She intended to expose the entire network of experimental plantations and ensure that no other families would suffer as hers had, even if it meant sacrificing her own life in the process. Nancy began secretly documenting everything she could find in Dr. Harwick's study, using her literacy skills to copy crucial information onto scraps of paper that she hid throughout the plantation. She memorized the names and locations of other collaborating plantations, copied correspondence that revealed the involvement of government officials and prominent citizens, and most importantly, learned the exact formulations and applications of every chemical compound in the doctor's extensive arsenal. Her pregnancy was now in its final month, and Nancy knew with growing certainty that her time was running out. Soon, her child would be born and subjected to Dr. Harwick's evaluation process, and if the baby showed any signs of intelligence or physical development that contradicted the doctor's theories, it would be murdered just like the children of her sisters. The knowledge that she was carrying a baby who might be killed within days of birth filled her with a desperate rage that grew stronger with each passing day, fueling her determination to ensure that the Harwick family would pay for their crimes. But Nancy had discovered something else in the doctor's files that made her mission even more urgent. Evidence that the breeding program was about to expand dramatically. Dr. Harwick had received approval and funding from Confederate sympathizers in Richmond to increase his operation from 200 subjects to over 1,000, making Harwick Plantation the largest experimental facility in the South. New buildings were being constructed on adjacent properties, and additional research subjects were being purchased from slave markets throughout the region with the goal of creating a comprehensive database of racial characteristics that would support Confederate political arguments. The horror that Nancy and her family had endured was about to be inflicted on hundreds of other innocent people, and the systematic murder of children that had already claimed the lives of her nephews was about to expand to an industrial scale. The time for careful planning and patient observation had passed. Direct action was now necessary, regardless of the personal cost or the likelihood of survival. Nancy's daughter was born on a cold February morning in 1853, delivered by her sister Sarah in the cramped confines of their cell, while a winter storm raged outside the research facility. The labor had been long and difficult, lasting through the night as wind howled around the converted tobacco barn and ice formed on the barred windows. But when dawn finally broke, Nancy held in her arms a perfect child, healthy, alert, and already showing signs of the intelligence that would doom her under Dr. Harwick's evaluation system. The baby was beautiful in the way that all newborns are beautiful, but Nancy could see in her daughter's bright eyes and responsive movements the very qualities that Dr. Harwick would identify as problematic. The child's alertness, her apparent awareness of her surroundings, and her strong physical responses to stimuli were exactly the characteristics that had condemned her cousins to death in the name of scientific research. Nancy held her daughter for exactly 18 precious hours, memorizing every detail of her face and trying to compress a lifetime of maternal love into those brief moments before Dr. Harwick arrived with his measuring instruments and evaluation protocols. When the doctor finally appeared, accompanied by his sons Thomas and William, who had been trained to assist in these evaluations, Nancy felt her heart break as she was forced to hand over her child to the man who would almost certainly order her death. The examination was thorough and terrifying, conducted with the same clinical precision that Dr. Harwick brought to all his research activities. He measured every aspect of the infant's physical development using calipers and other instruments, tested her reflexes with sharp probes, and made detailed observations about her responses to various stimuli while dictating his findings to Thomas, who recorded everything in yet another leather-bound journal devoted to documenting the characteristics of experimental offspring. When Dr. Harwick finished his examination after what seemed like hours of poking, prodding, and measuring, his verdict was predictably damning. The child showed excessive cranial development, abnormal responsiveness to visual stimuli, and troubling signs of cognitive advancement that contradicted his theories about racial intellectual capacity. In his clinical notes, which he dictated aloud while Nancy listened in growing despair, he described the infant as a significant deviation from expected racial norms and unsuitable for the continuation of the experimental bloodline. The execution was scheduled for the following morning, to be carried out using the same plant-based toxins that had killed Nancy's nephews. Dr. Harwick explained, with the same detached scientific tone he might use to describe any other laboratory procedure, that the child would be given a carefully measured dose of the poison that would cause rapid organ failure while appearing to be the result of natural weakness. The death would be recorded as infant mortality, a common occurrence that would raise no suspicions, and the body would be disposed of in the same manner as the other failed subjects, buried in unmarked graves in a remote section of the plantation where no questions would be asked. That night, as Nancy held her condemned daughter and listened to the sound of her steady breathing, she finalized the plan that she had been developing for months. She had already identified the locations of all the chemical compounds in Dr. Harwick's laboratory, memorized the daily routines of every family member, and prepared the tools she would need to implement her revenge with devastating precision. But this would not be a simple act of vengeance driven by maternal rage, though such rage certainly fueled her determination. Nancy intended to expose the entire breeding program and ensure that evidence of Dr. Harwick's crimes would reach authorities who might be willing to act, even if such authorities were few and far between in the slaveholding South. She had identified several prominent abolitionists in Richmond and Washington who would be horrified by the systematic infanticide taking place at plantations throughout Virginia, and she believed that if she could survive long enough to get information to them, perhaps other families could be saved from the horror that had consumed her own. Nancy's plan required precise timing and nerves of steel that would have impressed military strategists. She would need to simultaneously neutralize every member of the Harwick family who had knowledge of or participation in the breeding program, secure and preserve evidence of their crimes in a way that would ensure its eventual discovery by outside authorities, and create a situation that would force investigation by officials who might otherwise be inclined to ignore atrocities committed against enslaved people. The chemical compounds that Dr. Harwick had intended to use for torture and murder would become instruments of justice, administered with the same clinical precision that the doctor himself had used in his experiments. But Nancy's revenge would not be quick or merciful. She intended for the Harwick family to experience the same prolonged suffering that they had inflicted on others. to understand what it felt like to be helpless and condemned while their fate was decided by someone who viewed them as less than human. At midnight, as the storm continued to rage outside, Nancy kissed her sleeping daughter one final time and placed her gently in Sarah's arms. "No matter what happens," she whispered to her sister, her voice barely audible above the wind, "protect her. Get her away from this place if you can. Tell her someday that her mother died fighting monsters, and that she must never let anyone make her forget that she is worth more than all their theories and measurements combined." Nancy slipped from her cell, having long ago learned to manipulate the simple lock that secured the research facility through careful observation and patient practice. The plantation was quiet, except for the usual night sounds of the Virginia countryside, mixed with the storm's fury. And even the guard dogs knew her scent and paid her no attention as she made her way toward the main house and the laboratory, where the instruments of her revenge waited in their carefully labeled bottles. Dr. Harwick's laboratory was secured with a heavy padlock that would have deterred most intruders, but Nancy had observed him opening it hundreds of times during her cleaning duties and had memorized every detail of the process. The key was hidden in a small wooden box beneath his desk, exactly where she knew it would be, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture and carefully positioned so that its absence would not be immediately noticed. Within moments, she was inside the converted tobacco barn that had served as the headquarters for so much suffering, surrounded by the instruments and chemicals that had made possible the systematic murder of innocent children. The laboratory was eerily quiet in the storm's aftermath, with only the sound of wind through the wooden walls and the occasional creak of the building settling in the cold air. The chemical compounds were arranged exactly as she remembered them from her countless hours of observation and cleaning. The concentrated lye solution sat in a large glass container on the top shelf, clearly labeled with Dr. Harwick's precise handwriting and stored according to the safety protocols he had learned from his correspondence with other researchers. The muriatic acid was stored in smaller bottles near the doctor's desk, each one carefully sealed and dated according to when it had been prepared. Nancy carefully measured out precise quantities of each compound, following the mixing instructions she had memorized from Dr. Cartwright's correspondence with the same attention to detail that Dr. Harwick himself would have used. The process was dangerous, as the chemicals produced toxic fumes when combined, but Nancy had observed enough of the doctor's procedures to understand the necessary precautions. The resulting solution was a clear, odorless liquid that would cause immediate and permanent blindness upon contact with human eyes. But Nancy's plan required more than just the blinding compound. She needed to ensure that the Harwick family would survive long enough to experience the full consequences of their actions, and that evidence of their crimes would be preserved for authorities to discover when the inevitable investigation began. Nancy prepared 7 small glass vials of the blinding solution, one for each member of the Harwick family, using the same precision instruments that Dr. Harwick had used to measure chemicals for his experiments. She also gathered several bottles of other chemical compounds that Dr. Harwick had used in his research, including the plant-based toxins that had killed the infants and various marking solutions used to identify experimental subjects. But the most important part of Nancy's plan involved Dr. Harwick's comprehensive records. His journal contained detailed documentation of every murder, every experiment, and every correspondence with collaborators throughout the South. These records, if properly preserved and delivered to the right authorities, could expose the entire network of breeding facilities and prevent future atrocities from being committed in the name of scientific research. Nancy carefully wrapped the journal and related documents in oiled cloth and hid them in multiple locations where they would be discovered by investigators, but remain protected from the elements until that discovery occurred. She also prepared a detailed confession, written in her own careful hand, explaining her actions and providing specific information about the crimes committed at Harwick Plantation, the identities of collaborators throughout the region, and the location of evidence that would support her accusations. The main house was completely silent as Nancy made her way from room to room, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years navigating these spaces while remaining invisible to their occupants. The Harwick family slept peacefully in their comfortable beds, unaware that their victim had become their judge, jury, and executioner, and that their comfortable world of scientific racism was about to collapse around them in the most literal and painful way possible. Nancy's first target was Dr. Harwick himself, the architect of the breeding program, and the man who had personally murdered her nephews and planned to kill her daughter in the name of scientific progress. She found him sleeping in his study, surrounded by the books and papers that had provided the pseudo-scientific justification for his crimes, his face peaceful in sleep, despite the horrors he had committed. Nancy stood over the sleeping man for a long moment, holding the first vial of blinding solution and thinking about all the children who had died because of his twisted theories. She whispered a prayer for her dead nephews, for her condemned daughter, and for all the other victims of the breeding program before carefully applying the chemical drops to Dr. Harwick's closed eyes with the same precision he had used in his experiments. Dr. Harwick's screams as the acid burned through his corneas were loud enough to wake the entire household. But Nancy had anticipated this reaction and used the resulting confusion and panic to her advantage as family members stumbled through the darkened house trying to understand what was happening to their patriarch. The sounds of terror and confusion that filled the house were like music to Nancy's ears, a symphony of justice that had been too long delayed. One by one, Nancy administered the blinding solution to each member of the Harwick family, moving through the house with systematic efficiency while they blundered about in darkness and pain. The teenage sons, Thomas and William, who had assisted their father in his experiments and measurements, received their doses while still half asleep and confused about the commotion. The daughter, Margaret, who had watched the evaluations of newborn babies with the same clinical detachment as her elders, was blinded while trying to flee to her parents' room. Colonel Jeremiah Harwick, the elderly patriarch who had provided the funding and property for his son's research, received his dose while attempting to load an old military pistol with hands that shook from age and terror. Captain James Harwick, the overseer who had supervised the breeding program and disposed of the murdered infants, was blinded while trying to organize resistance against what he assumed was an attack by rebellious slaves. Mrs. Cordelia Harwick was Nancy's final target, and her application of the blinding solution was accompanied by a detailed explanation of exactly why justice was being administered. Nancy wanted Cordelia to understand, in her final moments of sight, that her blindness was payment for every child who had been murdered in the name of her family's twisted scientific theories, and that her comfortable life of privilege had been built on a foundation of systematic infanticide. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Nancy's terrible night of justice. But Nancy's revenge did not end with the blinding of the Harwick family. It was only the beginning of a systematic campaign of retribution that would ensure their slow and agonizing deaths. Nancy's revenge did not end with the blinding of the Harwick family. As their screams echoed through the main house and they stumbled blindly through rooms they could no longer navigate, crashing into furniture and calling out desperately for help that would never come, Nancy was implementing the second phase of her plan, a systematic poisoning that would ensure their slow and agonizing deaths while preserving them long enough to face the full consequences of their actions. The plantation's water supply came from a deep well located behind the main house, hand-dug by enslaved workers decades earlier and lined with stones that had been carefully fitted to prevent contamination. Nancy had long ago identified this as the most efficient method for delivering the plant-based toxins that Dr. Harwick had used to murder infants, as every drop of water consumed by the family would carry their death sentence. Nancy carefully measured out doses of the various toxins she had taken from Dr. Harwick's laboratory, following the precise formulations she had memorized from his journal with the same attention to detail that the doctor himself had used in his experiments. The resulting mixture included extracts from pokeweed, which would cause progressive organ failure, oleander compounds that would attack the cardiovascular system, and castor bean derivatives that would destroy the liver and kidneys over the course of several days. The toxins were designed to cause gradual organ failure over the course of several days, allowing time for symptoms to develop and for the victims to understand exactly what was happening to them. Unlike the quick deaths that had been administered to the murdered infants, the Harwick family would experience prolonged suffering that would give them ample opportunity to contemplate their crimes and understand the justice of their fate. Nancy poured the entire solution into the well, ensuring that every drop of water consumed by the Harwick family would carry their death sentence. The toxins were colorless and nearly tasteless, designed to be undetectable until the poisoning had progressed too far for any possible treatment, even if such treatment had been available in rural Virginia in 1853. But Nancy's plan extended beyond the immediate family to include the overseers and guards who had enforced the breeding program and participated in the systematic murder of children. She knew that some of these men had families of their own, including innocent children, and she was not willing to harm people who bore no responsibility for the crimes committed at Harwick Plantation. However, the adults who had participated in the breeding program or who had knowledge of the infanticide deserved the same fate as their employers. The overseers' quarters were located near the main house, arranged in a neat row of small buildings that housed the white employees who supervised the plantation's operations. Nancy visited each building in turn, moving silently through the pre-dawn darkness while the occupants slept peacefully, unaware that justice was finally coming for their crimes. Ferguson, the head overseer who had personally restrained infants during Dr. Harwick's evaluations, received a full dose of the blinding solution while he slept. Nancy had watched this man hold down struggling babies while Dr. Harwick administered lethal injections, and she felt no mercy as she applied the acid that would destroy his sight forever. The stablemaster, who had helped dispose of the bodies of murdered children in unmarked graves throughout the plantation, was blinded as well, receiving his dose while he tried to rise from his bed in response to the screams coming from the main house. Nancy was methodical and thorough, working her way through every person on the plantation who had knowledge of or participation in the breeding program. The plantation's clerk, who had maintained the records of experimental subjects and their breeding schedules, was blinded in his office while trying to understand the commotion outside. The doctor's assistant, a young man from Richmond who had helped with medical examinations and chemical preparations, received his dose while attempting to flee the plantation in panic. By dawn, 9 adults had been blinded and the entire water supply had been contaminated with lethal toxins. Nancy had accomplished her primary objectives with systematic efficiency, ensuring that everyone responsible for the breeding program would pay the ultimate price for their crimes, while preserving evidence that would expose the entire network of experimental plantations. As the sun rose over Harwick Plantation, casting long shadows across the tobacco fields and illuminating a scene of justice finally served, Nancy returned to the research facility where her daughter and sisters waited. She knew that her actions would soon be discovered by authorities and that her own death was inevitable. But she had accomplished everything she had set out to do. The Harwick family would die slowly and painfully, experiencing a fraction of the suffering they had inflicted on others. And more importantly, the evidence of their crimes would be discovered and the breeding program would be exposed to the world. Nancy spent her final free hours writing detailed letters to abolitionists in Richmond and Washington, describing the location of Dr. Harwick's records and providing specific information about other plantations involved in similar experiments. She also wrote a lengthy confession explaining her actions and motivations, ensuring that future investigators would understand the full scope of the horrors that had taken place at Harwick Plantation and the desperate measures that had been necessary to stop them. The letters were hidden in various locations around the plantation, wrapped in oiled cloth and placed where they would eventually be discovered during the investigation that would inevitably follow. Nancy also prepared detailed instructions for her sisters, written in a code that she taught them during those final hours, explaining how to locate and deliver the evidence if any of them survived the retaliation that was sure to come. The first sign that something was seriously wrong at Harwick Plantation came when Dr. Edmund Harwick failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with Richmond officials on March 15, 1853. Harwick had been expected to present his latest research findings to a committee of Confederate sympathizers who were interested in using his work to support their political arguments about racial inferiority, and his absence from such an important meeting was completely out of character for a man who had built his reputation on scientific reliability and professional punctuality. When Harwick's colleague, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, arrived at the plantation for the meeting, accompanied by two prominent Richmond businessmen who had been funding the breeding program, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The main house was filled with the screams and moans of the blinded Harwick family members, who were stumbling blindly through rooms they could no longer navigate, while suffering from the progressive effects of systemic poisoning that was rapidly destroying their internal organs. Dr. Cartwright's initial assumption was that some kind of industrial accident had occurred, perhaps involving the chemicals used in tobacco processing or a contamination of the water supply by natural causes. But as he examined the victims and assessed their condition with the clinical skills that had made him one of the South's most respected physicians, it became clear that their injuries were too precise and systematic to be accidental. The pattern of blindness was identical in every victim, suggesting the deliberate application of a carefully prepared chemical solution rather than exposure to industrial contaminants. The symptoms of poisoning, meanwhile, indicated ongoing exposure to multiple plant-based toxins that would have required extensive knowledge of chemistry and botany to prepare and administer effectively. Someone had deliberately administered a carefully prepared blinding solution to each member of the Harwick family and had systematically poisoned the plantation's water supply with compounds that were causing gradual organ failure. The precision and planning required for such an attack suggested a level of education and scientific knowledge that contradicted assumptions about the capabilities of enslaved people. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Nancy's revenge, and more importantly, the systematic infanticide that had triggered it. Dr. Cartwright, despite his own involvement in the breeding program and his development of the theories that had justified it, was genuinely horrified by the evidence of mass murder that Nancy's actions had exposed. The detailed records in Dr. Harwick's laboratory painted a picture of scientific experimentation that went far beyond anything that even the most ardent Confederate sympathizers could justify or defend. The systematic murder of infants, the use of enslaved people as experimental subjects, and the network of collaboration with similar facilities throughout the South revealed a level of organized cruelty that shocked even men who had spent their lives defending the institution of slavery. Local authorities were summoned from Richmond, but their investigation was immediately complicated by the political sensitivity of the case. The breeding program had involved prominent families throughout Virginia and had received support from Confederate officials who were planning to use the research to justify secession and the expansion of slavery into new territories. A thorough investigation threatened to expose a network of collaboration that extended to the highest levels of Southern society and could undermine support for the Confederate cause before it had even begun. Nancy herself was discovered in the research facility, sitting calmly with her infant daughter and her sisters while awaiting the inevitable consequences of her actions. When questioned about the blinding and poisoning of the Harwick family, she provided a detailed confession that included specific information about the location of evidence and the names of other collaborators in the breeding program throughout the region. Her confession, written in clear, educated prose that surprised investigators who had expected an illiterate field hand, described years of systematic infanticide disguised as scientific research. Nancy provided precise details about the methods used to murder babies, the locations where bodies had been disposed of, and the network of communication that connected experimental plantations throughout Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. The Virginia authorities found themselves facing an impossible situation that challenged every assumption they held about justice, law, and social order. Nancy had committed multiple acts of assault and attempted murder, crimes that would normally result in immediate execution under Virginia law. But her victims were guilty of atrocities that were shocking even by the standards of antebellum Virginia, where violence against enslaved people was commonplace and rarely punished. The systematic murder of infants, even slave infants, violated both legal and moral boundaries that most Virginians were not willing to cross, regardless of their views on slavery and racial hierarchy. The use of enslaved people as experimental subjects for scientific research crossed lines that even the most ardent defenders of slavery found difficult to justify, particularly when that research involved the deliberate killing of children. More problematic was the political dimension of the case, which threatened to expose Confederate sympathizers and government officials who had supported or funded the research. The evidence that Nancy had preserved implicated dozens of prominent families and revealed a network of experimental facilities that extended across multiple states, all operating with the knowledge and support of people who would soon be leading the Confederate government. The death of the Harwick family from systemic poisoning took place over the course of 6 agonizing days, during which Dr. Cartwright and other medical professionals attempted to provide treatment despite their horror at the crimes that had been committed. The plant-based toxins that Nancy had used were the same ones that had been specifically developed for their lethality and resistance to treatment, making medical intervention largely futile, even with the best knowledge available in 1853. Dr. Edmund Harwick died first, his body ravaged by multiple organ failures, while his destroyed eyes wept tears of blood and pus that stained his pillows and bed linens. His final hours were spent in delirium, calling out the names of the children he had murdered and begging forgiveness from people who could no longer hear him. His final words, recorded by Dr. Cartwright in a report that would remain classified for over a century, were a confession of his crimes and an acknowledgement that Nancy's revenge was justified. "She did what any mother would do," he whispered through swollen lips that could barely form words. "God forgive us for what we became in the name of science. The children, all those innocent children, they deserved better than what we gave them." The other family members followed over the next several days, each death more agonizing than the last as the toxins systematically destroyed their internal organs while they remained conscious enough to understand what was happening to them. The teenagers Thomas and William spent their final hours calling for their mother, who was herself dying in the next room, their voices growing weaker as the poison ravaged their young bodies. Margaret, the youngest daughter, lingered the longest despite her age, her strong constitution fighting against the toxins while she experienced the full horror of her family's slow dissolution. Her final words were a plea for Nancy to spare her life, a recognition that the enslaved woman held the power of life and death over the family that had once owned her. Colonel Jeremiah Harwick, the elderly patriarch who had funded the breeding program, spent his final days in a state of blind delirium, calling out orders to long-dead soldiers and reliving battles from the War of 1812 while the poison slowly shut down his organs. Captain James Harwick, the overseer who had supervised the breeding program, died cursing Nancy's name but acknowledging the justice of his fate. Mrs. Cordelia Harwick was among the last to die, her aristocratic constitution prolonging her suffering while she experienced the complete destruction of everything she had believed about racial hierarchy and social order. In her final hours, she called Nancy to her bedside and begged forgiveness for the crimes her family had committed, though whether this represented genuine repentance or simply fear of divine judgment remained unclear. Nancy watched these deaths from her cell in the research facility, holding her daughter and waiting for her own execution, while feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction, sorrow, and grim determination. She had accomplished everything she had set out to do. The Harwick family had experienced a fraction of the suffering they had inflicted on others. The evidence of their crimes had been preserved and documented, and the breeding program had been exposed for the horror that it was. The Virginia authorities ultimately decided that a public trial would be too politically damaging and too likely to expose the broader network of experimental plantations that operated throughout the South. The systematic murder of enslaved children was difficult enough to justify, but the involvement of prominent families and government officials in scientific experimentation made the case politically explosive in ways that threatened the stability of the entire social order. Instead, they arranged for Nancy to be quietly transferred to a remote facility where she could be held indefinitely without attracting attention from abolitionists or journalists who might use her case to attack the institution of slavery or expose the network of breeding programs. The official records would show that she had died of natural causes while in custody, though the truth would be far more complex and morally ambiguous. But Nancy had anticipated this possibility and had prepared for it with the same meticulous planning that had characterized her revenge against the Harwick family. Before her transfer, she managed to get her carefully prepared letters into the hands of Underground Railroad conductors who ensured their delivery to prominent abolitionists throughout the North and in Canada. Within weeks of her disappearance from Virginia, detailed accounts of the Harwick breeding program were being published in abolitionist newspapers throughout New England, complete with excerpts from Dr. Harwick's journals and testimony from enslaved people who had survived the experiments. The political impact was immediate and devastating for Confederate sympathizers who had hoped to use scientific racism to justify their cause and build support for secession among moderate Northerners. The exposure of the Harwick breeding program sent shockwaves throughout the network of experimental plantations that had been operating in secret across the South, as collaborators realized that their activities were no longer hidden from public scrutiny. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, faced with overwhelming evidence of systematic infanticide that his theories had inspired and justified, suffered a complete mental breakdown and spent his final years in an asylum outside Richmond, raving about the ghosts of murdered children and the terrible justice that Nancy Green had administered. Other collaborators in the breeding program network faced varying fates as the scandal spread throughout Southern society. Some fled to remote locations in Texas or Arkansas, where they hoped to escape the political fallout from Nancy's revelations and continue their work in greater secrecy. Others attempted to destroy evidence of their participation, burning records and eliminating witnesses in desperate attempts to avoid the fate that had befallen the Harwick family. But Nancy's meticulous documentation had preserved enough information to identify most of the participants in the network, and her strategic placement of evidence ensured that investigators would be able to trace connections between facilities even when individual records had been destroyed. The systematic nature of her planning meant that the exposure of one facility inevitably led to the discovery of others, creating a cascade of revelations that ultimately brought down the entire network. The plantation itself was abandoned immediately after the deaths of the Harwick family, as local residents, horrified by the revelations about the breeding program, refused to work the land or purchase the property. Within months, the main house had been stripped of anything valuable by looters who showed no respect for the suffering that had occurred there, and the research facility had been burned to the ground by unknown parties who wanted to ensure that no physical evidence of the experiments remained. The Virginia State Archives, despite efforts by political officials to suppress the documentation of Nancy's case, preserved enough records to provide future historians with a detailed account of both the breeding program and Nancy's systematic revenge. These documents, classified for over a century and only recently made available to researchers, reveal the full scope of the scientific racism that preceded the Civil War and the desperate measures that some enslaved people took to protect their families and expose the truth. Nancy Green's story became a whispered legend among enslaved communities throughout the South, passed down through oral tradition and carefully guarded from the ears of slaveholders who might seek to prevent its spread. The tale of a woman who had single-handedly destroyed an entire family of slaveholders served as both inspiration and warning. Inspiration for those who dreamed of resistance and justice, and a warning about the terrible costs that such resistance inevitably extracted from those brave enough to attempt it. The broader political impact of Nancy's actions extended far beyond Virginia, and contributed significantly to the growing tensions between North and South that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The revelation that Confederate sympathizers had been conducting systematic experiments on enslaved people, including the murder of children, provided Northern politicians with powerful ammunition in their arguments against the expansion of slavery into new territories. The horror of the breeding programs helped solidify Northern opposition to slavery and made it impossible for moderate politicians to view the institution as a benign economic arrangement that could be gradually reformed. The evidence of systematic infanticide demonstrated that slavery inevitably led to the complete dehumanization of enslaved people and created opportunities for atrocities that civilized society could not tolerate. Modern historians who have studied the classified documents related to Nancy's case have identified her as one of the most effective individual resistors in the history of American slavery. Her systematic approach to revenge, her preservation of evidence, and her successful exposure of the breeding program network demonstrated a level of strategic thinking and execution that was unprecedented among enslaved people of her era. Nancy's success in turning the tools of scientific racism against their creators showed that enslaved people possessed the intelligence and capability that racist theories claimed they lacked. Her literacy, her understanding of chemistry and botany, and her ability to plan and execute a complex campaign of justice contradicted every assumption that slaveholders held about the intellectual capacity of African Americans. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Nancy's legacy was her success in protecting her daughter and ensuring the survival of her family line despite the systematic attempt to eliminate them through the breeding program. The child who was condemned to death by Dr. Harwick's twisted evaluation system not only survived but grew up to become a teacher and activist, working to educate former slaves and preserve the stories of those who had died fighting for freedom. Nancy Green was never seen again after her transfer from Harwick Plantation, and official records of her fate were never made public. Some accounts suggest that she was executed in secret to prevent her from testifying about the breeding program and exposing additional collaborators. Others claim that she was transferred to a mental institution where she spent the rest of her life in isolation, slowly dying from the psychological trauma of what she had experienced and what she had been forced to do. But there are also stories passed down through the Underground Railroad network and preserved in the oral traditions of escaped slaves that suggest Nancy managed to escape during her transfer and made her way to Canada, where she was reunited with her daughter and lived out her days in freedom. These stories, impossible to verify but cherished by those who tell them, speak of a woman who refused to let her sacrifice be in vain and who continued to fight for justice until her final breath. This mystery shows us that the horrors of American slavery extended far beyond the economic exploitation that most people understand. The systematic dehumanization of enslaved people created opportunities for atrocities that would have been unthinkable in other contexts, and the pseudo-scientific theories used to justify these atrocities were often more horrifying than the institution of slavery itself. The story of Nancy Green reminds us that resistance took many forms and that even in the darkest circumstances, individuals could find ways to fight back against injustice and protect those they loved. Her systematic approach to revenge and her success in exposing the truth about the breeding programs demonstrate that enslaved people possessed agency and intelligence that their oppressors refused to acknowledge. What do you think of Nancy Green's story? Do you believe her actions were justified by the crimes committed against her family? Were her methods too extreme, or was extreme action necessary in the face of such systematic evil? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.